Hi, my name is Stephen Kirsting, and this time on Your Shot My Way, we have a image submitted by Melissa of a scenic boardwalk wildlife area. Now, looking at this image, first thing we can say is it's a wide dynamic range image. We've got clipped blacks on the left side in the shadows here. We've got bright whites in the sky, probably almost blown whites in the boardwalk, which is actually a gray. So off the bat, this is going to be a hard scene to capture. I think it's done very well. We've got very little bit clipping, and we have no clipping in the highlights. So for a single image, I think this is captured about as well as you could. Could be pushed slightly further right. Being that it incorporates a lot of trees in the scene, this may not be suitable or as suitable for combining multiple exposures, bracketed exposures, because any wind is going to cause the trees to move, and that's going to be problematic when it comes to blending. So a single image approach to this and recovery, treating it, doing a HDR type of recovery, recovering shadows, recovering highlights, is probably the best choice. So exposure wise, let's look at the settings. ISO 200, 1/250th for 35 millimeter, f8. Now since it's got a lot of darks in it, we know we're going to be recovering some shadows. The lower ISO is better, and with a 35 millimeter, 1/250th is plenty of shutter speed. I think 1/100th, 1/125 at ISO 100 would have worked as well, depending upon the amount of wind affecting the trees. But the lower ISO is going to allow you to cover shadows in dark areas with less penalty. So I would have looked to try the lowest ISO I could get away with. Looking at the exposure in detail, depth of field focus. Now this was a 35 millimeter f8, and 35 millimeters is going to have a lot of depth of field in general. It's a shorter focal length. It's going to have more depth of field, so that's not bad. A 35 millimeter on a crop sensor has a field of view around 40 degrees, which is a little less than normal, but it's close enough that it's considered a normal perspective lens, a normal lens for APS, and that means this field of view of the lens is close to your primary field of view, so things look the same. And judging on that, I'm guessing this image starts at about roughly 10 feet in front of the camera. And looking for a point of greatest sharpness, it appears to be, right in this area. So right around there. So about another 10-15 feet. So we're focused out at around 25 feet or so. And that's not too bad, because a 35 millimeter lens at f16, the hyperfocal distance is going to be 3.5 times 3.5. I would just make it 3 times 4, 12 feet, and you can add 0.25, but I wouldn't bother, 12 feet. So hyperfocal distance is somewhere in here, where we should have focused at f16. At f8, it is 24 feet. So out here, right about where we are focused. But that means the depth of field is going to start, if we're at 24-foot focus, 12-foot distance to infinity. So this has worked pretty well because we're not starting right at the camera. f8, we're focused close to the hyperfocal distance. We're getting close to the maximum depth of field. Without getting rulers and calculators and stuff, tape measures, you're not really going to do much better than this as far as depth of field for this scene. So that was done well as well. Perhaps by luck, but it doesn't matter. Everything is about what I would have done. Now f16 would put the D7000 into diffraction slightly. Depending upon the lens, it could be sharper. 35 millimeter, I don't think so. So I don't really have anything to complain about. Now, it appears to have a lack of sharpness in the image overall, but the reality is, even with hyperfocal distance or depth of field, any depth of field, there's really only one spot that is in focus, and it's about here from what I can tell. And the problem is, the further away you go, the smaller the details get, so it's harder to resolve them, and therefore they look less sharp. So our sharpest point of focus is farther away, areas without actually a lot of detail to start with, and what detail there is small, so it doesn't come across as being terribly sharp. Then everything else, while it is acceptably sharp, it is not the point of critical sharpness, so they appear less sharp as well. And that's just the way it is. There's only ever one spot in focus. So other than treating it for sharpness and stuff, there's not much else to be done. I don't think a 35 millimeter prime lens needs to be stopped down beyond f8 for sharpness. So unless there's something else going on, this is about as good as you're going to get with this scene. Alright, let's look at developing this image. First thing I would want to do is I'm going to bring up the shadows. I'm just going to peg them. So right there we've brought out the detail in the dark areas, and then we're going to recover the highlights, and this is for the sky. Cover our clouds, and I'm going to bring up the saturation, but I'm going to do this with camera calibration, and I'm going to take the blue primary because this is dealing with actually the mosaicing of the sensor as opposed to the information as presented here, if that makes sense. This deals with how the sensor is interpreted, whereas hue, saturation, lightness deals with how it's presented after the interpretation. And I can go ahead and work with this as well. We can do, let's use luminance. Saturation is not usually the best choice. I'm going to use the picker because that's not going to really be blue as such. You can see it's bringing aqua down along with it. Kind of darken that up a little bit. This is getting a little bit excessive right there. So we're going to take a brush. We're going to paint over that area. Let me get a soft brush. So we'll feather this. Set the flow low. Masking is good. And we'll just paint over that. And then we'll adjust the saturation just to make it a little less heavy. And we'll go with that. Alright. To me, the exposure is still on the low side. We've got a pretty good gap here on the right side at this point. So we'll take the exposure and we'll bring it up. It is a sunny scene after all. We want it to be bright and cheerful. Somewhere around there, where we're at in clipping. You can see that it's blue. It's saying the blue color is slightly clipped. I can't even see where it's at. And then we have no clipping in the highlights. So that looks pretty good. Alright, for dramatic purposes here, I think I would like the boardwalk to be brighter and more uniform than it is. This part here to me is somewhat problematic. This is a little too bright along there, and I want light to lead us down this path. Alright, so we can do a few adjustments here. Let's see, we can reset this brush and we'll bring the exposure down a little bit just so I can see what I'm doing. Make my brush smaller. And we can just go over this area here. And with my flow set lower, I have to go over it a few times, but it prevents me from really overdoing it too much, too quickly. And we can tweak this. We'll try some highlight reduction. Not really seeing a result there. We can pull the contrast down. And I can use a new brush. We're going to just bring up that very dark spot right here. That's a little problematic to me. Okay, so we've recovered the sky, a little more drama there, evened out our exposure, and let's see what else we might want to do. Like I said, I do want to brighten this up, so once again I'm going to take a brush, use an exposure increase, and I'm going to kind of create a gradient manually. I'm going to turn the mask on so I can see what I'm painting. I'm going to create a manual gradient through here. I could use a gradient tool, but the fact is I would have to remove it from more areas than not. So it's just as easy to paint it in. Alright, then I'll go over the front half of this a little heavier. And then just run down the middle here. Turn that off. And we'll tweak the exposure. Something like that. So now I have a path of light that leads me down the trail and distinguishes it. It leads the eye in better than it did before. And we can look at sharpening and noise reduction if needed. I'm not really seeing a lot of noise. I'm seeing some color noise. So, and that's just pretty much typical of dark areas. So we'll put up color noise a little higher. Actually, there's already a bit applied. You could try a touch of luminance noise reduction, but I don't see it really being necessary. And we could try sharpening. Now that's obviously excessive, so we'll mask that out. Where it's just on the details. And if we wanted, we could go back and we could add some clarity, which is mid-tone contrast, and see what we're at. So here's where we started. Here's where we're at now. Right now it's still somewhat problematic to me, this area, and to fix this, the best choice is going to be Photoshop. Now I could do this with a clone tool. I take the clone tool, adjust my feather. I could come in here and paint over this area. And then I would select area. But you can see that really doesn't work that well. and I could mess with it as much as I wanted to. It's just not going to be ideal. So we'll get rid of that. And we'll go to Photoshop. So Command E to open it in Photoshop. And the first thing we're going to deal is with this area. To do that, I'm going to grab the Marquee Tool right here. I'll grab a selection that I want to use. Copy it and paste it to a new layer. And then we will move it into place. And we'll transform it. I'm going to put a little bit of perspective on this. Grab an edge. Now really, to get the best perspective control out of this, I'm going to need to apply a perspective. And we will, now you can see when I'm doing this with the perspective tool, it's making these boards back here smaller, recede into the distance, which is what I need. Because if I just warp it without the perspective, they stay the same depth. I'm going to go ahead and switch this over to free transform. I'm going to put this where we want it. That looks pretty good. And then we'll apply that and put a mask on it. In order to see what I'm doing, I'm going to go ahead and turn the opacity of this layer down. I want to mask out all the stuff I don't need, so I'll select the brush. Got the flow, I'll set the flow to 50 or 60%. Make sure we have a soft brush. And you can select one here. I use the Control-Alt-Drag method. If you're on PC, that would be right click, I believe. So we're going to paint this out where it doesn't belong. Now with a really soft brush, there's going to be a strong tendency to overpaint, which I'll see later when I turn the opacity back up. So we'll have to retouch this more than likely. Let's turn the opacity up, see what it looks like. Yep, I'll switch brushes, bring this edge in. That looks pretty good. Turn that off. Right, and get rid of some of that. That's wrong brush. Get rid of some of that. Soften that. And select this. I'm going to drag this out. I think it's a little small. And we'll zoom in to fix the rest of our masking. Make it smaller. You can make it harder. I just make it smaller. Oops. Better undo a couple because I'm on the wrong layer. I need to be on the mask. I'm not using any special tools. I'm using the keyboard and a touchpad for this. Let's turn it off and on and see what the effect looks like. It looks a little wonky right here. All right. I set my flow a lot lower. Just deal with that edge a little bit. All right, turn it off and on. See that we didn't mess anything up. Looks like there's a little bit right here. And it looks like we need to tweak the shape a little bit. So I'm going to grab about there. Oh, Command Z, I'm going to undo that. I'm going to break the mask loose. And then do it again, leaving the mask in place. Control click on this point allows me to move just that point. That looks pretty good. And then we'll finish refining the mask. Little tweaky in this area. Gotta remember to be on the mask when I'm doing this. Blend that in. And see where it overlays. So all this area in here we could get rid of if we wanted to. We could blend it in just a little more naturally. Alright, and then I'm going to adjust the tonality of this area a little bit, I think. A little too much dark, so let's go here, we'll go image, adjustment, brightness, contrast, and we'll get rid of some of the contrast in there. And bring up the brightness a little bit. I think that's a good blend. Alright, and we could go ahead and deal with other areas if we wanted to. That gets rid of that area which was disrupting the flow for me. And looking at our histogram, everything looks pretty good. You know, I might choose to bring the exposure up a little more, and let's do a levels adjustment for that. Let's start with a gamma. We'll just make this a little brighter scene overall. Bring down the darks a little bit. And maybe make sure our whites aren't set too high. Let's see what this looks like. There's where we started. There's where we are now. And then another option here is I can blend all layers together. So Command, Shift, Option, Command or Control, and E, paste all of them to a new layer as one visible image. So if I turn the others off, it's complete layer. I can then, I'm going to duplicate it again. I'll set this mode to screen. I'll set this one to multiply. Put these in a group. Right. And basically what I'm doing is I'm adding contrast. So the screen layer, I'm going to bring that down around 70% or so. And what happened there? That went to 1%. No, we don't want 1%. We want 70. All right, now let's see what we got. So just a little more contrast, a little more dynamic. And I think that's probably good enough. Good enough. Now, might choose. Now this is a problem here for me in that our file is getting large. We're now at 302 megs. 302 megabytes for this file because we've duplicated that layer so many times. So one option here is to flatten this as your final output, but then you lose all your layers to adjust. We could just flatten this layer and blend it down to here, or we could leave it as is. It's your choice. But as far as document sizes, it's starting to get towards the large size. We could go in here and we could take the screen layer, put a mask on it, and with a low flow we can take out some of these brighter areas that we didn't want as bright. And we could go down to the multiply layer and do the same thing and bring up some of these darker spots that we might be slightly problematic. And I would probably do another layer outside. Jeez Louise, get up there. Alright, and we'll do a gradient fill on this. We'll just fill it with mid-tone gray. And we'll set the mode to overlay. So it should have no effect. Let's go to soft light. There we go. Very little effect. Basically I have it a little lighter than mid, so I could adjust that. And then with a large soft brush and default colors, I'm just going to burn in the front a little bit. Make it really large. And then I'll switch to white. I'll set the flow even lower. Set the brush size smaller. Okay, so here's where we started from Lightroom, and this is where we are now. I think I would bring this down a little bit, just along those rails. All right, not spend too much time on this. Here's the image before. This is the image edited in Lightroom, and this is the image after editing in Photoshop. And that's about what I would do this. You could always spend a little more time. It might be worth doing a little exposure adjustments up here. I keep forgetting I'm a different program. Set this brush really high, set the flow really low, and we could bring down the sky. Side over here. Maybe that flow's a little too low.
Care to join me?
And so there you have it. We have the image as recorded, we have Lightroom edits, and then we have after Photoshop. And that's about what I would do with this image. I hope you found this helpful, and until next time when I see you again, have a great day.